All right, so let's get started. Very warm welcome to everyone who made it to this room and also to the online audience and the people who will watch the recording, because I know from several that they can't make it right now, but they will at some point in the future. But today's event, our team from the Geneva Center for Business Human Rights have been looking forward to, namely on engaged scholarship, something that we're trying through our work. We postponed this workshop with Uma Mishra because last time it didn't work out and we didn't want to miss it, so it was just postponed. So the warm-up already happened at the last Young Researcher Summit here just a few months ago in September in this room here in Geneva. But today we will learn from Uma Mishra, who is the campaign manager for #FreeLeJane.
Yes.
How she has created a campaign for FreeLeJane.
Yes.
She's a human rights defender from Saudi Arabia, known for her videos driving in Saudi Arabia, but also known as someone who spoke up for women's rights in Saudi Arabia. And she was in prison. She's now out of prison, but still not free. She's still in house arrest and unable to speak about her case. But Uma is based here in Geneva, and I hope I said this correctly, but you also have a PhD in chemistry?
Oh my God, no.
I have a chemistry degree.
I have a chemistry degree, yes.
Chemistry degree.
way too involved for that.
But speaking to you, I immediately realized you understand what it means to base a campaign on research. And again, that's what we're trying to do for our work on business and human rights. And I hope that scholars engaged in this field, business human rights, will do more than publishing articles, but actually take those articles as the foundation to then create recommendations that hopefully drive change in the world.
Yeah.
And with this, let me just quote Stephanie Priant, who's working for the ASCSB. It's an accreditation organization for business schools. We had an event with her last week, and she said, and that really impressed me, "You're not a scholar by publishing articles in academic journals. You're a scholar if you're trying to change the world with your research." That really resonated with me, and hopefully also with our work. And so we're looking forward to learning more from you and have more ideas for how we could do this work really well, building on our scholarship, hence building our scholarship, and translating it to practical.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Professor Baumann. And what a good preface to this conversation. I'm really excited to be here for those, and I don't know where exactly to look at you all that are online. But I'm really excited to be here. And as Professor Baumann said, I was supposed to be here in September and that didn't happen. So I'm very grateful to Professor Baumann and Pascal and the entire team for re-coordinating this session. Also on the last day of Human Rights Week here at Uni Genève, and then, you know, an important milestone for the Geneva Business Center for your 2-year anniversary yesterday. So thank you, congratulations to you all for that. So with this conversation, I really want it to be a conversation. I don't, you know, I'm a former teacher, high schooler, so a little bit more rambunctious group of individuals in chemistry, and it's a very, let's say, not involved topic, right? There's not a lot of movement. That's a pun intended, because atoms are always moving, and I will always be a nerd, and I will always make academic jokes. But I want this to be a much more collaborative discussion, right? And I'm sorry for the nerd jokes in advance. So I am an activist, but I am a nerd as well. And as Professor Baumann said, you know, my work involves really is involved in the women's human rights space, but also in the campaigning space. So I've been an executive director of Women's March Global. We started, as some of you may know, with the millions of women marching on Washington when Donald Trump was elected to office, and that took place as well here in Geneva. And you know, and we continued building on different mobilizations, different campaigns for women's rights issues globally. And so I was the executive director for that for a couple of years, and now have transitioned into working on racial violence and racial equity within the global development space. So altogether, within the human rights space, working on lots of different issues, but very happy to be here. What I want to talk about today, and you have to excuse me, as I've been battling this cold, as everyone in Geneva has in some way, is how you build on scholarship. And I, as Professor Bauman said, I've been in the academic space, I've been in the activist space. Both are kind of closed in a lot of ways. There's not many bridges between both of them. So I think it's important that we're able to really understand how we can imbue advocacy principles within an academic setting and kind of vice versa as well. And so what I want to talk about really today is kind of simple, but really going into the why, like why is advocacy a part of research? Why does it matter? And how is research politicized? Because we know that it is. It's part of the culture, unfortunately, that we live in. And how can you engage in advocacy as part of your research? And then go into some case studies. So I am, as a former teacher, going to give you some homework. It's inevitable. So the why does advocacy as a part of research matter? And again, during this entire thing, for those online, and again, I have no idea really where to look, so I'm like looking in different directions. Oh, hi. Great, thank you very much, I appreciate it. So for those online and for you all in the room, at any time, please unmute and ask questions throughout the process. So why does advocacy as a part of research matter? Any issue that we are working with in the human rights landscape as activists or even within the academic setting. I mean, I used to do a lot of chemistry, organic chemistry research during my undergraduate. It requires you to learn, right? Learning requires patience, it requires time. You all know this as academic scholars, but you have to take the time to understand the complexities, especially within the human rights landscape, especially within that landscape, because there are so many things that are politicized and turned on their head, right? And to get to the truth of what is actually happening within the human rights landscape takes a lot of digging, takes a lot of persistence, takes a lot of connecting to advocacy organizations that really understand and are in contact with grassroots movements and activists who are closest to the issues, right? The international organizations that are here, like Amnesty International, although they are great, they are not necessarily tied to the activists that are on the ground. They advocate for them for sure, but there are better organizations, I believe, that are working on a much more grassroots level that are important for you to link up with, right? That are important for you to learn from. One of the best examples, I think, that is current around how advocacy needs to be tied into research is what's happening in Saudi Arabia. And I talk about Saudi Arabia a lot, as Professor Bauman mentioned. My work as the campaign manager for the Free Loujain campaign started with Women's March Global, but I started supporting the family because I saw how unsupported families of human rights defenders are in this landscape, right? They have minimal, if any, resources from other human rights organizations to fight for their family's freedom on a day-to-day basis. And so that's where I stepped in as a campaigner to help build the campaign, to help connect with other international organizations and member states of the UN, to bring in the media and PR aspect. It was a massive project that required a lot of volunteer hours, but now we also have a children's book that's coming out in February as a result of this, right? Because again, it's a way to get the story out. But what's happening in Saudi Arabia, and for those who knows Loujain's case? Okay, so you know of Loujain. I can't see hands on the virtual side of things. So I'll just go over Loujain's case. Loujain was imprisoned after multiple times in 2018 for her most recent imprisonment. In May of 2018, she was actually, before she was imprisoned, she was kidnapped from the UAE, which we will talk about, in March of 2018, kidnapped from the UAE by Emirati police, thrown on a plane and taken to Saudi Arabia and imprisoned for 70+ days, then released and then re-imprisoned again in May of 2018, just 2 months before the driving ban was lifted by Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, right? And this was touted as an amazing reform, right? Vogue Arabia had a princess on their cover. Volkswagen and lots of other car companies were so excited to go to the kingdom and do business, and promote this tremendous effort, right? But Lujain and 11 other activists in that first round of arrests were arrested without any reasoning. They were held incommunicado. Lujain was held incommunicado for over 50 days. And during that time, she was tortured brutally, waterboarded, electrocuted, sexually assaulted. I mean, you name it. It was a gamut of torture by Saudi authorities. And remember that Lujain wasn't just fighting for the right to drive. Freedom is movement for women. It's something that has been restricted for women for so long in so many different ways. So that very basic thing was fundamental for Lujain. And not only that, she was fighting for civil liberties. She was one of the first women to run for public office. She was fighting for victims escaping domestic violence. She tried to open a shelter for women escaping domestic violence in the male guardianship system. That, of course, was never actualized. So in many ways, and as Professor Rahman said, she has been released. So that fight was won. Thankfully, at the beginning of this year, in February of this year, she was released, but she is under 3 years of probation. She cannot speak. She cannot do her activism. The same security system that imprisoned her is monitoring her. She is under a 5-year travel ban. And remember that her 3 siblings that are outside of Saudi Arabia can't go to Saudi Arabia to visit the sister that they have fought so hard and long for her release for. So it's devastating. And this is not an unusual case. This is the norm of what happens to women, especially in this country, who are fighting for freedom. So bringing it back to the business angle, if we take a look at what's happening in NEOM, which I'm sure you all have heard of, this is Saudi Arabia's smart city, right? And they want to do a lot of things with this smart city. Doing any research on the benefits of NEOM from a business perspective should it require you to really focus in on the layers of human rights issues that Saudi Arabia has. It should be imperative, like the two should be what is the word? Inexorably? Something. Thank you. That word, inexorably linked together, right? And so being in Geneva as well, there are so many, and for those of you that are not in Geneva and virtual, right, there are so many incredible organizations like Civicus, like International Service for Human Rights, and so many others that are working with grassroots activists on these issues that you can learn from, right? If we take a look at Amnesty International, we're going to use this as a case study later on. I'm sure you all have seen this white paper in some way, shape, or form, right? So Amnesty published this white paper on an assessment of human rights risks for business and investors in Saudi Arabia. And we're going to take a look at this as a case study because this was not done by academics. This was done by a human rights institution, right? And so what I would love for you all to do is just, as using your academic very fast reading skills, right? It's 9 pages, but read the executive summary and then some of the recommendation. Take a look at this during the case study and see where you as academic scholars could have supported Amnesty in providing better recommendations for businesses, because the recommendations are weak, in my opinion, for businesses, right? So where could you have, as academic scholars, supported this process, supported this human rights organization in this BHR process and assessment? So in this example, for Amnesty, they had published this white paper last year. And part of their white paper, there's a whole agenda that they go through, looking at the different layers of human rights abuses in this white paper. So they look at women's rights, they look at land exploitation, they look at corruption. There's like 9 different areas that they look at in this paper. I can't remember actually how many now. But in the middle of the paper, they look at the case study for NEOM, right? And I want to just point out this part right here, which I'll read for those who can't read this. So now I can't read it because I don't have my reading glasses. Beyond the fantastical dinosaur robots and the grand promises, there are very real reasons to be deeply concerned about the human rights implications of NEOM, which risk being the stuff of dystopian nightmares. We all love those. The company says it will utilize AI, robotics, and human-machine fusion to deliver greater predictive intelligence and enable faster decision-making across all NEOM sectors. 30 documents linked to the Wall Street Journal. The founding board, in these 30 documents, the founding board declared that NEOM should be an automated city where we can watch everything, where a computer can notify crimes without having to report them, or where all citizens can be tracked. The Wall Street Journal reports that there's an agreement for Israel to supply technology for the project, a matter of serious concern given the collaboration between Israeli technology companies and the Saudi state used to surveil and harass activists. So I want to go a little bit deeper into this, because what I find interesting in this assessment is that this is the only mention of the link between Saudi Arabia and Israel and the use of what we now know as Pegasus spyware. How many of you have heard of Pegasus? Right. It's scary AF. I'm also ex-military, so I swear a lot, and I apologize, Professor Bauman, if that comes out. It's really scary. For those of you who haven't actually watched The Dissident, the movie that came out that detailed the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, watch it, because you will understand the length that a government, specifically Saudi Arabia, has gone to surveil its population, right? And how they use this technology, which literally is squarely situated in the business and government space, to surveil and harass and murder activists. So what I find interesting is in this white paper, they don't actually go into the layers of human rights issues that are linked between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And from an academic perspective, this is where, in my view, this could be bolstered in such a big way, because if we just take a look at news, right? And this is very recent, right? So we have the United States blacklisting the Israeli firm, which is NSO Spyware, behind Pegasus. Mass surveillance fuels oppression of Uyghurs and Palestinians. Israel, like China, weaponizing surveillance technology. Who's surprised? Pegasus spyware in the direction of Australian policing. So like, we are covering the world in this. We go to India and the Supreme Court's investigating Israeli spyware. Across Africa, how digital espionage tools exacerbate authoritarianism. And then human rights activists and dissidents and journalists targeted by Pegasus. And then finally, women within the Sawana region, within the MENA region, being targeted by this same spyware company. And yet this white paper isn't looking at all of these links. It's mentioned in a tiny sentence, but where is the expansion of the layers of human rights abuses that this spyware technology and the implications of it come in from a business angle, right, and a human rights angle? This, by the way, Loujane's phone was hacked by Saudi Arabia using Pegasus spyware, right? That's how her location was able to be found in the UAE. Jamal Khashoggi's phone was hacked using the same Jeff Bezos' phone. Same thing, right? No one is immune from what is happening with this spyware. No one. Also, if you receive a weird SMS, please don't open it, with some sort of link. Just don't do that. Use Signal. We can talk about digital security measures, if you go into the activist space, and there's many great organizations that work on that, but just be mindful. I am very mindful, but be mindful. So if we're taking a look at this, this is in that same section, right, where the NEOM case study was presented. This is the recommendation for businesses that is provided. Have a read through it. Businesses and investors should be fully aware of the risks they pose for others. Due diligence procedures should take account of whether business partners could potentially fall foul of the royal court for political or other reasons, and avoid any actions that could place potential partners at additional risk to their safety. You all can talk about this later in your little homework session on how this is failing to have any impact, in actually pushing businesses here to do the right thing. So this is kind of one example that I wanted to bring forward as to why advocacy is so important, and further sitting with all of the different layers of human rights discussions, whether they happen in organizational settings, whether they happen at the grassroots level, is really important. But this is also where community engagement as a part of research comes into play, right? I am by definition, I think, a community builder. I love building coalitions. I love gathering people, across sectors to fight a specific issue. And so even for the Free Loujain campaign, we literally, and if you look on our website, gathered support from every far corner of the world that we could gather support from. So even from the, oh my God, my French is going to be really horrible here, but the Institut Droit de l'Homme in Normandy, in the region Normandy, Loujain was awarded the Prix Libertaire by I think it was 15 to 20-year-olds that do this human rights prize every year. So they've supported us, right? And the Sorbonne, where Loujain went to school, has supported us. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, to the most basic grassroots organizations, Al-Qasd, that is a human rights organization that's embedded in Saudi Arabia, has supported. But it took time for us to build all of these connections, right? Loujain's case didn't garner the international attention that that we saw it garner really towards the end of last year and the beginning of this year, without all of that active collaboration. I mean, literally, it was me saying, on this day, we need you to send this tweet out. We need you to contact your MP. We need you to build, send this email. And literally like going through 3 different email Google groups to send out that same messaging. It was campaigning at its most basic level and a most exhaustive level to literally build up the media attention that you saw come out of some of the stories on Loujain, right? But this building of community is essential as a part of research, because involving the human rights community, I don't see how you can do business human rights research or scholarship without actually having a foot in the human rights space. It's like you're living in a building that has no doors and you're breathing the same air and you're just building your own echo chamber, right? If you're not challenging your views and you're not being challenged by the human rights community to think about business issues differently or your research differently, then that trust-based interaction isn't being built, right? And isn't being fostered. And that's so critically important. That process, the engagement, is part of inclusion efforts, right? And inclusion, and we hear this especially in the EDI landscape, equity, diversity, and inclusion is so vitally important, right? Your work is integral in the discussions of business and human rights, but human rights at large, not just BHR, right? Remember that it's not just BHR that's affected by your work. It's a whole human rights landscape at large. And so it's imperative for you as academics to engage with these advocacy institutions, right? As part of trust building, as part of inclusion, and demonstrating that there is mutual respect between both, right? I want to just ask, do you feel right now that there are good bridges between the human rights community and the BHR academic space? Do you feel like those bridges exist? They're really silos. It's interesting. I mean, the same problem exists within, for example, the women's rights landscape, right? When we segment women's rights and we look at our right to, safe access to abortion versus our right to education as 2 separate rights, and not that they are interlinked in some way to bodily autonomy, right? At large, we do this within, I think, every sector. But this is also why we have to fight against our kind of human conditioning of isolating ourselves in some way. There's a great, I don't know if you all have heard of this, Citizen Lab. There's great kind of initiatives by companies and grassroots organizations to encourage community building more around specific issues. I mean, hell, if you take Clubhouse, right? Many of you know Clubhouse. Clubhouse is literally a community engagement platform because you can gather around a specific issue, hold debating conversations around those. I mean, granted, there's a lot of trolls, right? We see this with a lot of conversations that happen around Sawana region issues on Clubhouse, that there are a lot of trolls that we need to monitor. But that is in essence a community engagement platform. And it would be interesting to me to see what you all think of engaging with, for example, Citizen Lab or something like Clubhouse to just listen in to what conversations are taking place around the issues that you are researching, just to gather that it's almost like an anthropological study, right? Just to gather those voices, just to understand it. Yes, it's more work, but I think it's critical. And what is also interesting to me is that the research in the human rights space is not being done necessarily by researchers, right? It's being done by consultants that are really aware of the issues, that have worked on the issues, right? And that help to build the bridge between the international organization and the grassroots community. So there are a lot of consultants in the middle that help build those, but why couldn't the same consultants be utilized by the BHR community and academia to help gather polls of the people that you are looking at in terms of whoever is impacted by the issues that you are studying? Why couldn't you, for example, utilize those same consultants? Why couldn't you utilize the same network that's in place in the human rights community to help gain access to the people who are affected by the issues you are studying, right? So just some food for thought on that. I'm going to pause. Questions on that first part?
Engaging as middleman. I like to replace the consultants, actually be them, yet keep my research hat on, and conduct research in a way that is inclusive and creates those relationships during the research process, because that's well invested time. Since once your research is completed, you actually want to see put into practice. That's when you need those relationships.
Exactly.
You have to build them during the research process, get back to them regularly, and also once you're done, then the actual work and collaboration should start with those key stakeholders in your given area of research. I see one reason why those worlds are often so disconnected in the problem that research questions interesting for academia are not necessarily interesting for practice.
Right.
So many of us work on things that practitioners really don't care about.
Right.
I mean, there are still discussions being held about whether businesses have human rights obligations. And I'm like, haven't we moved on from that? I mean, we're working since a decade on the actual implementation.
Right.
So are we really still discussing the whether? Hey, but there's a rich body of academic literature on it. But the practitioners cannot engage, because they're like, sorry, but we need to figure out how to do this.
Yeah.
And so the academic incentive systems for publishing often reward rather philosophical research questions that are not as applicable, I think, as the ones that our practitioners are looking for. But that's my observation. Others? Does that correspond in your perspective?
Yeah.
Legal research question I address in my PhD, and I totally see the point of engagement, but especially if you talk of law, it's so abstract to see how to include people affected, because you cannot even maybe define who are the communities that might be affected. So I totally see the point, and I totally agree with what Doris said, that there is just this divide, and I feel particularly where I do my research, they're just academics. It's a tiny university that is not really particularly engaging with civil society. So yeah, I'm grateful to learn. That's why I think this is a really relevant discussion.
I think, to your point, Professor Baumann, the consultants that are working with those grassroots community, I agree that the work should be done by academics, but they also have the trust of those communities, which is for marginalized and racialized populations. They have a massive distrust of academia for various reasons, and we can get into that at a later date, right? So it takes time to build that trust in so many ways. And from a legal perspective, it's interesting because I have a friend that literally, she's a human rights lawyer, but she just started an organization, or is starting an organization, to help activists understand the legal implications of doing the work that they do. A great example of this is Sarah Binder. Sarah Mardini. She was a Syrian refugee that came into Greece on a rubber dinghy with her sister. Both were, like Olympic swimmers, are Olympic swimmers, and they helped to pull the boat to safety. And Sarah and, a few other activists are now, 20 other activists, not a few, 20 other activists are now on trial in Greece they have been charged with human trafficking, for helping refugees in Greece, for giving them life jackets, for pulling them out of the water, right? And so from a legal perspective, I think it's interesting, like, I think about this a lot as well, right? For the work that I do, what are the legal implications? And this is also why, even from the Racial Equity Index perspective, we have a pro bono legal firm, literally there to support us, because we know that from an accountability perspective. So background on the REI is that we are working to build an accountability index rating system to hold global development organizations accountable on racial equity. But in doing that, are we going to get sued by, by international organizations who are unhappy about the fact that we are literally calling them out in a way that they haven't been called out before? And this is why we have a pro bono legal team to help support us in that. And we, the same thing was true with Women's March Global. We knew that we needed that support because we never knew like when those legal issues would come up. But many activists do not have that understanding or support, and also moving across like multinational borders. And especially when you have issues that transcend borders, how do we, from a legal perspective, then really understand the implications that we will face in doing the work that we do? And there's a massive way to go in terms of the education. So I think there's a real opportunity for sure for the application, for where you're coming from. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, if I may add, I think there are always areas of application. It's just you're not really encouraged to necessarily tease that out. It's not needed for most academic publications. On the trust building, I'm so with you. But, again, it gives me feedback on our rather broken academic system where you're encouraged to switch topics, rather than stay with one field for a significant amount of time. To give time to trust building gives me feedback on how do we train our PhD students. Is relationship building a skill we find important? No, right now not, but when we're hiring for our team, I just discussed this with Pascal. I said, we need a personality that is engaging, that can build trust and can build relationships with the key stakeholders, but it's not something that is typically required from top researcher. Right, and I just think it should come with a package. You can no longer compartmentalize rigorous research skills and the rest is secondary. No, it has to come together. And I think a more diverse skill set is what will make future researchers successful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But that leads us into this next part in terms of why should you care that research is politicized? And I'm sure you all care that research is politicized in some way, but the truth of the matter is that even if your research isn't being politicized, someone is politicizing it in some way, shape, or form, right? This study this article by The Intercept, and if you don't actually get The Intercept, I highly encourage you to do that because they're a great investigative journal. But The Intercept uncovered the fact that Yale University researchers had published a study showing that, no surprise, that folks in the United States were being billed enormous amounts for their healthcare. Who's surprised? The U.S. healthcare system is shit, to be really honest. But the study by Yale placed the blame squarely on hospital and staffing companies and not insurance companies. And we know that the insurance, literally industrial complex, is the driving force behind the $1,000 insulin bills and everything else, right? Big pharma and big insurance. But for Yale University to not even actually acknowledge this and place the blame on hospitals and staffing companies is absurd. The Intercept revealed that United Healthcare, the largest insurance company in the United States, was actually helped to frame the study, right, by Yale University and obscure this data. But who's surprised, right? We see this within the media. We see this within politics and governments, how research is literally twisted on its head to support an argument, and how companies are funding their own research. I mean, we know in the United States, the DeVos family, right, has what is the Heritage Foundation, right, literally, which is funding and supporting and building right-wing research to help support claims like this, right? So you have research being politicized in every way, shape, or form. We see this as well with COVID, right? And we've seen this with COVID. The scientific community has, I think, been hit with a massive realization, especially scientists, that have studied vaccines and studied, infectious diseases, how politicians are cherry picking data for their own political gain. A good example of this, I think, is Ted Cruz, and who's the other guy? Rand, well, what's his name? Kentucky governor, right? So listen to any one of these House committees, right, where they're belting out, their one-line academic things on COVID for their political gain, right? And so it's really interesting. This was a thing that was published, the belief that politics drives scientific research and its impacts. This article is interesting if you have a chance to read it, and I'll send this presentation, which has the links and the notes. But this part here, right? Public distrust in scientists could complicate efforts to combat COVID-19, given that risk assessments are strongly associated with one's propensity to adopt preventative measures, it goes on to say, right? But this study is not something that's just restricted to COVID or something that's restricted to scientists, right? It's something that is much broader in terms of the landscape. So this statement from the same article, right, I think carries weight, especially even here. It's not just Americans. I mean, we know Americans, for example, are bad at geography, right? we know this. I'm saying this as a US citizen, right? We tend to think we live in our own island and bubble, but we are also very uninformed about the science and scientific process, but also that applies to the research process and methodology, right? We are completely uninformed with especially human-led research, right? That you have to go through an IRB process, that you have to really take all of these measures into account. And so you all as academics have a very important role to play in ensuring that the public who is reading your research is informed. You're shaking your head. The public, who is reading, where's the microphone? Academics are reading the academic, but the public in some way reads your research, right? Doesn't it get distilled down?
I agree with you that the public reads whatever is being simplified to layperson's language. But it's not by you, it's not directly your research that they're reading, right? So I'm not an academic, by the way. I come from corporate law. I used to be a lawyer, and I'm a consultant. Maybe you like that, but
depends on which company.
Here at the Geneva Center,
Okay.
thankfully. But anyways, what I was going to say is what we see a lot is that, and like that's one reason actually I personally decided not to pursue a PhD, is that PhD holders speak to other PhD holders and don't really have impact. So there comes, this presentation obviously by you, that's so valuable. But what I see is that, I mean, if you get like 15 reads on your academic research, then that's like a good number. So there's definitely, as we saw in other, situations, again, this silo of academics writing for other academics. And I mean, we've talked about this last night, earlier today. It's always the same thing, that in the case of American public or any, public, it's not the research that researchers conduct, that academics conduct, it's how it's being conveyed. And when you said earlier that, you know, how like things are taken out of context, I just listened last week to Anthony Fauci on New York Times The Daily with Mike Barbaro. And he was so hesitant, even though this is a very liberal media resource, right? And he was so like cautious about what he was saying, because he said, like, I say things in certain contexts and they just take it out, and like Republicans use his statements to support their own arguments. Oh, but then 100%. Fauci said this and that. And it's really scary because he's like the head scientist, and throughout this whole pandemic, and even his words are being obscured. So I mean, I'm just ranting.
There is a huge fear, right? And this literally was a headline out of Indonesia. There is a huge fear of the impact of the politicization of research. And I hear you that while an entire paper is only going to be really read within the academic setting, we all know that things will be cherry picked, and the media will take one line out of your 15-page, research paper and represent that as the data, right? And the quote and the percentage point when it's completely out of context. But this is also why, and if we look at this as well, this was just published in June, right, out of Denmark. And I don't know if you all heard about this, right? Ministers of parliaments are now starting to police, who's surprised, police universities in being too political in their research, right? So there's a restriction. We see this especially in the United States, with academics being literally restricted to a very specific box, right? To a very specific framework for the fear of being too political. As we in the activist space like to say, the personal is political. There is no other way around it. Our lives, especially those from marginalized and racialized populations, our lives literally are politicized in one way, shape, or form. Our existences are politicized in one way, shape, or form. And so for us as activists, there is no other choice than to speak out against things like this, that restrict us in these spaces. And for academics, it has to be the same. Because the link, unfortunately, is there, right? The link between your research being politicized and taken out as a soundbite, and the fact that your entire paper is only being read by academics who refuse to look at the world in a more intersectional lens, right? And understand that there are so many links, right? It's a knock-on effect. Eventually, it's going to come to your doorstep, right? As we see here. This is a good question. I don't know the answer to. I'll send this presentation. It's got the link to the University World News article. Professor Bauer.
Just two quick comments. First, I think this shows that it does take courage to engage in research that may be politicized, but it shouldn't hold you back to still do it, to research the toughest research questions in your field. The other conflict I see in our field on business and human rights, there are advocates for doing this research without companies. And I think you can't, study this without the subjects. But how do you engage with companies at an arm's length to make sure you keep those companies at a critical distance to your independent research while engaging them, while needing them to get access to data, to understand their real challenges. So that is a delicate balance, I think, because the most precious thing for researchers is the independence, and nothing should jeopardize this independence. At the same time, you have to engage with companies and how to set up these company relationships in a way that are engaging yet respectful of each other's roles. That is something that needs to be, I think, adjusted every time you engage. But I know a lot of scholars that are shying away from doing that at all. Because they feel like they're already in the lion's den when they talk to a company. And that I really disagree with, because then you can never get to those really precious insights that companies bring to the table.
I don't, it's interesting because even in the human rights landscape, we face the same criticism, right? If we work, for example, with a government that is supportive on one human rights issue, but not another, right? We would get blowback from the human rights community of like, they're not supporting us. Why are you working with them? But for us as human rights activists, we walk into these conversations with a set of value propositions, right? So I think even from a methodological perspective, and I'm saying now from Racial Equity Index, right? We've been accused of bias in our research, right? We are not academics, but we are a group of development workers that have all experienced racism. We have economists in our group. Our work is independently peer reviewed. We have a dean of an international management and policy on our peer review group, right? And another economist from LSE in our peer review group. So our work is heavily peer reviewed because we know as a racialized group, we are all BIPOC people in this group, that our work is going to be even micro picked apart in that way. But we have literally set values for our interaction with other organizations. So there are organizations that we know upfront that are red lines for us that we cannot engage with. And there are other organizations that we will engage with. However, they need to be understanding that these are our boundaries in these conversations. And I think it could be the same for academics. There's no reason, I don't see how you do BHR research without actually engaging with companies. It's surprising, but to your point, and I come back to this, right? We can remain in these silos, right? We can remain closed off in our academic setting and our human rights setting, but at what point does your work then become irrelevant, right? If you're just comfortable in your little cabin, then you could live happily at 80 in your little cabin, but you're not reaching the outside world, right? So at what point is your work irrelevant? And then this was something that Professor Bauman had sent me, the link to the Engaged Scholar, and I'm sure you all have heard of this, and Andrew Hoffman, right? But there is an excellent quote from him, right? Scholarship rarely moves far beyond the walls of the academy and is certainly not accessing the primarily civic spaces it needs to reach in order to mitigate truth corruption. This as well, this argument that academics shouldn't be political. This, I forget the year this was published. This is a little bit older. I want to say it was 2012, and I'm sorry that everyone's like choosing between research rigor or support for advocacy movements, a false dichotomy. I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but there's a part of this that I just want to highlight. Advocacy is viewed by some as an inappropriate activity for researchers, as it is believed to undermine the neutrality of the research and potentially to negatively affect research rigor. Some researchers have been more comfortable with a research uptake model where researchers simply repackage research for non-academic audiences, believing this to be more neutral. However, this allows knowledge brokers and policymakers to cherry pick the evidence that appears to support an existing position, and thus is no more neutral and perhaps less rigorous than engaging directly with advocates, right? So a really good argument to directly imbue advocacy in your research. I'm going to pause there before I get to the how, which is the shorter section. Questions, comments, concerns, insights?
The article you just referred to looks super interesting.
I'll send you the link. I'll send you the link. Okay, gonna get to the how, and I'm just looking at the time. And this is a shorter section, but then I want you all to do the case study part. So how should you all as academics fight against misinformation and for scientific integrity? And this is also within the human rights space, right? We always say within the human rights space that we have to show up fully. So that means we show up with the knowledge that we don't know everything that we don't know, right? We don't know about the issues that we don't know about. We have to take the time to learn about those issues. It's vital for us as activists to ensure that, one, we're not co-opting other people's work or other people's knowledge. We're not speaking for, right, people who have been made voiceless, right, by either authoritarian regimes or oppressive regimes, but that we are also understanding of the work that's already taking place and happening. Because, the reality is that within the human rights landscape, I don't think that there is an issue that isn't being actually actively organized around. It's happening. We may not know about it, but it's happening. And the same thing is happening within the research setting in some way, shape, or form, right? So the research around your topic probably isn't new. It's taken place in some way, shape, or form, and the issue is there even within the human rights landscape. But it's up to you to make that link and be authentic and say, I don't know what's happening in the human rights landscape. Can you educate me? Can you help support that influx of knowledge? The reality is that as the boundaries of this world and the countries shrink and shrink and shrink, this tie between local, regional, and global also does. But here in Geneva, there's a great representation of it at the Human Rights Council, right? And I don't know if you all have watched the very fascinating and exciting live TV at the Human Rights Council. It's actually, there are some exciting sessions at the Human Rights Council, but I invite you to, because what's interesting is that literally you can hear member states negotiate human rights and women's rights off the table as they negotiate their UPRs, the Universal Periodic Reviews, and the recommendations that are made by civil society to governments on how they can do better in human rights, right? So there are organizations, ISHR does a really good job of this, the International Service for Human Rights. They literally track the recommendations given by civil society activists and organizations to institutions, to member states, and track then the progress of these member states. The UPR process is a 7-year process, right? And so from an academic point of view, this is a really good place to just kind of jump in if you're looking at what governments are doing to understand the layers of what they are negotiating off the table. Good example, like an inside example of this is when, do y'all remember the gas explosions in Saudi Arabia that took place 2 years ago, right? What was happening then? There was a Human Rights Council session. We wanted the member states to come together on another statement against Saudi Arabia. And literally we were told it's not the right time because this oil explosion happened, right? So it was like, so you won't talk about it because the oil exploded. But these human rights issues are still happening, right? Right. And we saw it literally the decrease of support for that statement in particular to Saudi Arabia from member states, which is so disappointing. But if that isn't being tracked and noted, not only by human rights activists, but also from an academic setting, like if you're not noting that in your research that these landscapes are shifting and they're based on literally business decisions, it's just living in a silo then, right? Some ideas in terms of targeting your research around a particular issue, connecting, look, I'm an introvert and I'm recommending this, and I have social anxiety as well. So for me to get up and talk in front of people, like I'm literally sweating, but I enjoy it in some way. Connect with human rights institutions and organizations, right? There are so many to choose from, so many. And I'm not, don't just go for the amnesties and the human rights watches and the big ones, right? Go for the grassroots ones. Look at the organizations that are literally working in the countries that the issue is that you're looking at. Connect with MPs. Surprisingly, parliamentarians and foreign reps, right, of the member states here in the United Nations are very talkative. They want to meet people. They want to really understand the issues around human rights, and they're willing to hear different perspectives, right? You can ask for a meeting, with foreign representatives quite easily. It's not a difficult thing to do. But if you are looking at a human rights issue in a specific country, it's interesting to get their perspective as well, and also what they are doing and what they are not doing from a business and human rights angle. Because remember that what the negotiations that take place, especially at the United Nations, literally are centered around BHR. Literally, right? It's the arms deals, the millions of dollars of sales. It's the oil deals, the millions of dollars of sales. It's the companies, right? The lobbyists from all of the different trades, right? The tobacco industry, the firearms, and all of the negotiations are around human rights are centered around business. So there is no reason to not connect in that way. Building an advocacy campaign with organizations, and this is again going back to this idea of building community around the issue that you're researching, right? So literally gathering people, whether they be grassroots organizations or institutions or activists or families of defenders that are affected by the issue that you are fighting, so that not only, as Professor Bauman suggested, you have that access in the research part, but then also in the dissemination part, right? So you finish your research, you publish your research, and then where does it go, right? Go back to the people that you just literally have spent, a year, 2 years with, to build a campaign for your research, right? To help disseminate that information. Because again, it goes back to this question of relevance. If you are not pushing your research out there, how is it relevant? Because in this day and age, 2021, it is, right? And hopefully that link has been made clear. And then last, right, utilizing platforms like Citizen Lab and others that are directly supporting community engagement. So you can either work with them to build those community connections or understand better how to do this. One of my favorite examples of academia transferring over into the kind of social justice space, let me say, is the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of Berkeley in California. The Othering and Belonging Institute, and I don't know if you all know of them, they're really wonderful in the fact that literally this is a community of people, scholarship, research, social justice leaders, organizations that have come together to hold forums to talk about these issues from a social justice perspective. So it's a really great example of how bridges are trying to be built between academic scholarship and other settings. So I encourage you to take a look at them. They are in Berkeley, I mean, it's no surprise, right? California is super progressive. So this is, it's great that they're there, but take a look at, the work that they do.
Yeah. I love this. I want to look them up because I really don't know them. But generally, so the idea that academic centers are also important convening spaces that offer enough neutrality to bring often opposing stakeholders to the table is something that I'm very keen to explore more for the Geneva Center. It was a bit hampered with that pandemic now, but I really see that's a unique power that academic centers could explore further. Yeah.
I mean, literally, if we're not providing all of the different arguments for educating ourselves on an issue in a literal academic setting, then what are we doing?
But also bringing people together that otherwise wouldn't come to the same room. So.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm going to move now. How much time do I have left, Professor Brown? 30 minutes. Okay, so we're going to do this. We're going to do this like case study thing. I'm wondering how to do this. For those on Zoom, I'm going to send you this link. For those in the room, what is your suggestion, Pascal?
Can you pull it up on the screen?
Absolutely. Sorry. Let me just do, where is this?
So the task is to, how would we have, as academics, made their white paper stronger?
Yeah, so let me just go through the white paper really quickly. So what I want you all to do, and for those on Zoom, you can pull this up on your computers, or if you're on your phone, you can still pull it up on your phone. But what I want you all to do is just take a look at this white paper. It's 9 pages. And what you will see, and if you just quickly skim through, use your awesome research skills to skim through, and I'm just going to do that. Can you all see that better?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to delete this and minimize that. And hopefully you should see this. Nope, I'm going to minimize this. Can you see that better? Okay. So you can skim through the intro and then the executive summary. Give me like a grunt or something when you're done skimming the executive summary. Sorry? Exactly. They held it virtually. They held it. Yes, he did. He did. It was before this, yes. So I'm going to then point you all to, for those that are on Zoom, to go to number 4, the risk in terms of the risks that they cover. And this is where the NEOM project is housed, the NEOM study, and then also the risk to business partners. And have a read through those. And for those in the room, I'm going to scroll to that right now. Have a read through how they present those risks and the recommendations, and just have a discussion. And we can do this together. Oh my gosh, where is it? I can't talk and scroll at the same time. This one. Okay. So have a discussion on the recommendation for businesses, like what you feel is lacking here, and how an academic approach or scholarship approach could have supported this white paper better. So this is risk number 4. So this is now the business recommendation. And then I'm going to scroll down. Is everybody done reading this recommendation? Yeah. I'm going to just scroll down here to the risk for business partners. This is another risk that they had detailed. Yes, they were rounded up in the hotel and tortured there as well. Let me know when I can scroll. Okay. And then this is the recommendation for businesses. So it's literally just this. How does one become fully aware in a context like that? It's okay. Where's the microphone? Can you all use the microphone? And then also for those that are on Zoom, I'm just gonna stop share. Can you all unmute? Because I would love for you to be involved in this discussion as well, and hopefully we can hear you. So I'm seeing Samantha and hi Samantha, I just saw you unmute.
Hello.
Hi. So what are your thoughts? Samantha, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. There we go. Sorry.
That's
I'm not
okay.
sure what was happening there.
So what are your thoughts in terms, I don't know if I'm doing this right, the volume, in terms of where the business recommendations or the recommendations fall short from your perspective?
Can I jump in quickly?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I think essentially the main thing that really jumped out at me was the lack of transparency of all of the recommendations, the lack of transparency as far as businesses are concerned. So while we're saying they have to be aware, and while they're saying they should maybe have certain policies or give consideration, we're not identifying how they would go about doing that. So it'll differ for different businesses, and it'll differ for different contexts as well. So where there is no external way of determining how they're supposedly complying with these recommendations, it means that there becomes then the possibility that they'll end up simply using excuses to turn to profit-making goals,
Right.
as it's easier for them.
Right. Yeah. Any other things that jump out at you? Samantha?
I think, again, the issue of definition. So sort of linked to the transparency issue, there's no real way of defining most of these terms so that businesses can easily understand them and apply them to their own processes. And so others can also understand how businesses are operating in those processes so they can better engage with them. So I think that sort of links to the transparency issue, I realized, but the definition aspect is something that, again, really jumped out at me, the lack of definitions.
Cool. Thank you for that. So we've got transparency, we've got definition. Any other big red flags that you see just in the two sections that we skimmed through? People in the room, use the microphone. Yeah.
Just some brief remarks. So there was no recognition at all of like engaging with local civil society. Obviously, I think that's maybe the biggest red flag, like what are your sources of information? And I found this passage on investor recommendations really superficial. And it's maybe a prime point of using due diligence as a box ticking exercise, as a pure process, and not totally dissolving it from the actual aim, which is a prevention and mitigation of human rights abuse. And in case that this cannot be guaranteed, that you actually withdraw from a business project. And none of this was actually mentioned. It was just 3 lines. And that was actually, not sufficient.
No, it's not sufficient. But what's interesting is that this is Amnesty International, right? This is a premier human rights institution that has produced this white paper, literally saying these are our recommendations to businesses.
I was saying you would expect them to be bolder than whatever the 3 lines, the very vague things that they've suggested.
Right.
And like I'm thinking of like if I were a business leader, a manager in a company, I would want to know the exact steps that they're recommending, more concrete things than just saying due diligence, conduct your due diligence. Like I would want to see like maybe even like a timeline, a process. This is what we recommend as the experts who have, researched the issue. Like this is again, like where we were missing the bridge. Not necessarily with academia, but I mean, that definitely, but also with a practitioner, like have a consultant there that is practicing, or was an ex, corporate manager in a company who understands the internal processes. So they can tell you, look, this is how it would work. This is where they should start in a company. I don't know, like it shouldn't, like I work in also part-time in the other hat that I'm wearing is a consultant at a business and human rights consultancy. And the questions that, especially now with the German supply chain law that's going to enter into force next year, well, in 2023 in Germany, is that they keep asking, well, what does this mean for my company, right? And that's like the #1 question, probably the only question we get. So that's what Amnesty International authors should be thinking. And I mean, a recommendation would definitely require a concrete step or steps, preferably, in this situation, and not just these really vague bullshit sentences.
Right. Let me ask you a question though. As a consultant that lives between both of these, spaces, would you, now seeing this white paper, reach out to Amnesty and say, hey, why though?
You can make great money defining, according to whatever you like, human rights due diligence to mean. I mean, there's an armada of consultants out there right now that actually try to figure out what human rights due diligence is for individual companies, and they're all like define it differently according to their own gusto. So there are no standards, no metrics, no means of it. So this Amnesty paper, unfortunately, I think is emblematic for our business human rights field generally, that currently focuses so much on human rights due diligence without clearly outlining what's actually expected of a company that operates in a specific context. And so that is a general problem. But the argumentation to tell a company, yeah, someone at the UN has now decided that you should do human rights due diligence as the only argument why they should even care, is not very smart. I mean, the paper also includes not a single business argument why this is better business to actually look into these aspects. So how you operate in Saudi Arabia may backfire to you globally, you know, and engaging in good business practices in one country may actually help you in other countries. And so, I mean, at least try to speak a little bit to the business rationale that your target audience, namely businesses, will have as they're reading this, and just saying, the UN told you so, I mean, it's not going to cut it.
But where is then the impetus for centers like yours and other BHR academics to in some way hold Amnesty International and other organizations that are producing white papers that have recommendations for businesses to do this in a better way?
I mean, our theory of change is based on the idea of now human rights due diligence define what it means. And it can't be done by our center to define what it means, but we can have convening power to bring together the key stakeholders that should come together and figure that out. And there might be research portions to better understand what the human rights due diligence means. But this whole paper is like seeping of language that I find incredibly jargony, incredibly high level. And I mean, I read it and I'm like, is this English? Because I don't know what they mean. And I'm supposed to be in this field. So I find it incredibly frustrating that they speak in a way where I'm like, and it's become their own language now. I mean, next week is the UN Forum for Business Human Rights. Right. This is where they speak this language. Right. And for practical implications in companies where maybe one person speaks that language, but the other 100,000 employees of that big company have no clue what they're talking about. Right. That's problematic. How do you then really make this real in a company context? Most salient human rights issues, the due diligence requirements, the impact assessment. I mean, all this is way over people's heads, and it puts human rights at a pedestal where they shouldn't be. It should be the way how you do business every day. Right. It shouldn't be so holy, but actually applicable, and the way how you organize your business. And I really think it's hindering understanding and progress in practice. No, absolutely. Anybody else have any thoughts on this, either online? I know, Reem, you're also, I think, still online. Oh, Reem, you're here. Sorry, do you want to add?
About remedies, and for example, they were like, the companies are obliged to take the lands, but in fact, they should provide something to these people and speak with them and also implicate them in the processes of the expansion of their. Well, especially in this context, we know how violent Saudi Arabia is. Exactly. You know, and also it seems, I don't know if it's true, accurate or no, but while we were reading, I felt that they were trying to show that the state was actually trying to do something, but to help out the people, but in fact they were just participating to really the implementation of the project without taking into consideration anyone. Yeah, I mean, Lena Lujain's youngest sister, and who's been her biggest advocate, has said many times that Saudi Arabia is very much now a police state because it's run by a de facto ruler. Like MBS shouldn't actually be in power if they were following, what the traditional monarchy had set into place, right? It shouldn't be MBS in power, but he is. But they help, and their definition of help is very twisted. Go ahead. And I mean, the paper also entirely conceals that in this context, the government is part of the problem from a human rights perspective. And I think that is the case in probably 80-90% of the countries around the world these days. So good recommendation for businesses would be, how can you set up a fair community engagement process independent of the government as well? Like, how can you do this due diligence through a community engagement process
that is meaningful and independent of government interference, and that is not like even touched upon in this.
But this is where Civicus's work. So Civicus has a monitor literally that every year they publish their recommendations on how closed or open civic spaces in around the world, right? And so the link between the closed or open civic space, and literally it's a world map that you can go and see and click on the country. But literally the link between how closed or open the civic spaces should be a signal to businesses on how open their ability to actually do business in that country can be. Go ahead.
If I was working at Amnesty International, I think one thing I would definitely put into this white paper would be to inform, educate the business audience about the power and leverage that they have, because Saudi Arabia does not have a developed industry. They have the money, but they don't have anything else.
Exactly.
So you coming from like the Western world with your, state-of-the-art technology, you have so much leverage, and you can actually not bend, that's the wrong word. You can actually have the government or whoever you're dealing with on the other side do things because they need you so much. It's like that leverage that you have. Companies don't know that most of the time. And in many cases, if you're, for example, in the defense sector, if you're in like high technology, unique technology production industries, then in those cases, Saudi Arabia, unfortunately, also gives you more than what, let's say, you would have like lower margins, profit margins with any other country that you're dealing with. But with Saudi Arabia or Qatar or like similar, like oil-rich, gas-rich economies, you get that profit. And that's why you're more interested in making that, deal get that deal to happen. And you don't really look at the leverage that you have because you're just focused on the profit that you're going to make. And the KPIs that you're going to meet at the end of the year. Yeah. But you could actually use that power the other way, because they need you, especially if you have a unique technology that only you can supply to them. And I think I would educate in that white paper, I would tell them, like, use that power, use that leverage, because you are the ones that are actually sitting at the negotiation table with the Saudi government or whoever, department that you're speaking to, whereas everyone else does not have that position. Right. Like, you are in such a powerful position. And if you really care about human rights now, this is the time to act.
Right. It's interesting because human rights activists have done a lot of this work in holding businesses accountable, where we've seen success. And if we think of celebrity and entertainment as a business, which it is, right? We've seen Mariah Carey and Nicki Minaj cancel their concerts in Saudi Arabia. Now Justin Bieber is being pressured to do the same. But businesses themselves haven't felt that pressure. And I think this is also where that link between academia and what's happening in the activist space, because our recommendations come from a human rights perspective, right? From that activist perspective. It's not based in the knowledge that you all have on how to speak to businesses in a way that they will actually understand, right? And that's where the link is missing in a lot of ways. Yeah.
And those activists, unfortunately, often conclude you can't do business there.
Exactly.
And, from a business and human rights perspective, this is often too crude, because then you have no leverage. I mean, I'd rather figure out, for me, this is the last resort, to not be there. But under what conditions can business be fair in these contexts? This is something I'd like to figure out. I want businesses to be successful and make money, but all this with respecting human rights principles. And I think it's possible, but this has to rise and elevate to a level where human rights are discussed on par with the business interests. So, absolutely. Just cutting or not going anywhere or boycotting, that's not going to be a solution, because indeed then other businesses will do it anyway. And so rather figure out how can we establish a level playing field when you do business in Saudi Arabia, for example.
Yeah, like the wheel of capitalism isn't going to stop turning anytime soon, right? So there has to be accountability in that. I don't disagree with that. I'm noting that we have 5 minutes left, and so we're not going to get to the second part. The second part of what I wanted you all to do is to pick one of the issue areas that you are researching, or that you have researched, and just discuss how you could build better advocacy or community engagement efforts with that issue. And that's something, you know, like if you all have questions or want to run ideas, I'm happy for you to email me and happy to support in you know, helping you build those ideas. But unfortunately, we won't have time for that. But
I mean, we're trying to employ sort of an arsenal, you know, of things, from public writing to events to engage like partnerships with other key organizations. Right now, for example, we have so little capacity for our work on human rights in the finance industry. So we partnered with another big multiplier. We are now doing a public event to, well, keep that work stream alive that is built on research that for now is completed, but now we have to make sure, I mean, in this first step, that the key audience, namely financial institutions, are paying attention that finance is not just like sustainable finance, not just green, but also there's a human rights aspect to it. That is sort of a first step. But often it's a matter of capacity, you know, I mean, it's not that we're short of ideas, but this relationship building, and often I feel like that was the easy part to do the research.
yeah,
It comes to an end, but then the question is, how do you also like fund the follow-up? And the follow-up requires sort of, every 2 weeks you should, you know, send regular emails to key players, and sort of that has really put a strain on us continuing sort of the work.
it's interesting because in the philanthropic space within global development, this is also a discussion, right? How do we actually, and philanthropists and foundations, you know, are funding research because I think they are recognizing that this is a part of global development and activism and social justice that hasn't been as supported as it needs to be, right? And we need that foundation that we don't necessarily have. But also foundations have pretty amazing access to grassroots organizations that they are funding to work on the issues that they support as a foundation, you know? So I think if there's,
but I would go as far as saying we need more seed funds, because getting the research funded is one thing.
Yeah.
But it's the second phase that is incredibly laborious, for which you often don't have something concrete to say. The research report is done, but you're talking to James Nicholson, you know, of Trafigura once a week, and it's time consuming. And that is what it takes to actually ensure that eventually your recommendations are being put into practice. You may write an op-ed, you may do an event in the meantime, but you can't have that funded. You know what I mean?
For
it's
sure.
the second phase where something really concrete.
I feel your pain. So much of the work that we do as activists is unfunded. Yeah, no, so I feel your pain on that. But you have to go. Yeah. Okay. Oh God. Okay. Sure. But thank you all for listening in, and Samantha, thank you for listening in online.
Thank you very much. No, it was really interesting. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.